March 15, 1999, Palermo District, Buenos Aires. Carlos Vega had been hiding from his past for 13 years. Tonight, his past walked through the front door of his nightclub wearing a Argentina jersey and a knowing smile. The enforcer who mocked Claudia Maradona was 22 years old, cocaine confident. He didn't know that the quiet club owner in the corner had once put 3 bullets in a man's chest for less. He also didn't know that Diego Armando Maradona never forgot a face. When the kid finished his cruel impression of Maradona's wife stumbling drunk, the room erupted in laughter. Everyone except 2 men. Diego stepped forward, looked directly at Carlos, and spoke 5 words that turned blood to ice water. "I remember you from Medellin." 30 people heard those words. Within an hour, half of them would be dead. The Medellin cartel had rules about witnesses, and Maradona had just reminded everyone that some debts never expire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the smoky room. Carlos felt every muscle in his body coil, the old reflexes awakening after 13 years of forced dormancy. His hand instinctively moved toward his waist, where he'd once carried a .38 snub-nose, but found only the soft fabric of his expensive Italian shirt. Diego Maradona stood 15 feet away, his eyes locked on Carlos with the intensity that had once terrorized World Cup defenders. The soccer legend's face showed no emotion, but Carlos could read the calculation behind those dark eyes. The same calculation he'd seen in the faces of cartel bosses who held men's lives in their palms. The young enforcer, the kid who'd just mocked Claudia, finally registered that something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. His cocaine-bright grin faltered as he looked between the 2 older men, sensing danger but too high and too stupid to understand its source. "Diego, hermano," the kid laughed nervously. "What are you talking about? This is just Carlos. He owns the place. He's nobody." Nobody. Carlos almost smiled at that. Once he'd been somebody's worst nightmare. Carlos El Martillo Vega, the hammer that drove nails into the cartel's enemies. The man who'd earned his nickname by breaking bones with methodical precision until targets begged to tell him whatever he needed to know. But that was before Medellin. Before the night, everything went wrong. Maradona took a step closer, his movements deliberate and predatory. "Carlos Vega," he said, tasting each syllable. "Or should I call you by your real name?" The blood in Carlos's veins turned to ice water. For 13 years, he'd been Carlos Mendoza, respectable nightclub owner, Argentine businessman who'd made his fortune in real estate. The U.S. Marshals had given him a perfect new identity, complete with backstory and documentation that would fool anyone who wasn't Diego Armando Maradona. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Carlos said carefully, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Around them, the party had gone silent. 30 faces watched the standoff, sensing they were witnessing something significant but not understanding what. Diego smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Carlos had ever seen. Worse than any cartel boss, worse than any federal agent. This was the smile of a man who'd been planning something for a very long time. "March 3, 1986, Diego said softly. "The Intercontinental Hotel in Medellin, room 412. You were wearing a blue shirt. There was blood on your hands." Carlos felt the world tilt sideways. Nobody knew about that night. The official records had been buried so deep that not even the DEA could find them. The witness protection program had been built around the guarantee that those memories would stay buried forever. The young enforcer was looking back and forth between them now, his drug-addled brain finally processing that he'd wandered into something far beyond his comprehension. "What the fuck is happening here?" "What's happening," Diego said without taking his eyes off Carlos, "is that chickens are coming home to roost. Isn't that right, El Martillo?" The nickname hit Carlos like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud since 1986, since the night he testified before a closed federal grand jury and traded everything he knew about the Medellin operation for a new life in Buenos Aires. Carlos scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential weapons with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd survived in a world where hesitation meant death. The main entrance was blocked by Diego's entourage. The service exit led to an alley that could be a trap. The office upstairs had a window, but it was a two-story drop to the street. "You're making a mistake," Carlos said. "The only mistake I made was waiting 13 years to have this conversation." Diego pulled something from his jacket pocket. Not a gun, a photograph. He held it up so Carlos could see. It was a Polaroid from that night in Medellin. Carlos recognized his own face, 13 years younger, standing next to a body that should have stayed buried forever. In the photo, he was looking directly at the camera, with the flat, emotionless expression of a professional killer. "Smile for the camera, El Martillo," Diego said. "Just like you did that night." Carlos felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. 13 years of building a legitimate business, of creating relationships with politicians and police commissioners, of becoming a respected member of Buenos Aires society. All of it built on the foundation of a lie that Diego Maradona was about to expose. The young enforcer was backing toward the exit now, finally understanding that he'd stumbled into something way above his pay grade. But Carlos knew it was already too late for any of them. The Medellin cartel had a simple rule about witnesses. They didn't get to stay witnesses for very long. The photograph trembled slightly in Diego's hand. Whether from age or emotion, Carlos couldn't tell. But the image was crystal clear, a moment frozen in time that Carlos had spent 13 years trying to forget. The harsh flash had captured everything. The splattered wall behind him, the expensive suit ruined beyond cleaning, the methodical way he'd positioned the body to send a message to anyone who might find it. "Put that away," Carlos said quietly, acutely aware of the 30 pairs of eyes watching them. Politicians, judges, police commissioners, men whose respect he'd cultivated with patience and careful bribes. Men who thought they knew Carlos Mendoza, the smooth businessman who threw elegant parties and never asked inconvenient questions about their own dark dealings. Diego tilted his head, studying Carlos like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "You know what I remember most about that night? Not the blood, not even the screaming. It was how calm you were afterward, like you'd just finished reading the newspaper." The words hit harder than any physical blow because they were true. Carlos had been calm. It was what had made him valuable to the cartel, his ability to do necessary work without losing himself in the violence. Other enforcers got high on the power, made mistakes, left loose ends. Carlos had been different, professional. Until that one night when being professional hadn't been enough. "I don't know what fantasy you've constructed in your head," Carlos said, forcing his voice to remain level, "but you're playing a dangerous game." "Dangerous?" Diego laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to know what's dangerous? What's dangerous is letting a man like you build a new life on top of the graves he filled. What's dangerous is pretending the past doesn't matter." The young enforcer had reached the wall now, pressing his back against it as if he could melt through the plaster and escape. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the animal fear of a small predator who'd suddenly realized he was sharing space with apex hunters. Carlos tried to focus on the immediate problem, containing this situation before it destroyed everything, but his mind kept drifting to the phone call he'd have to make. Sophie was expecting him for dinner tomorrow night at her apartment in Palermo, his daughter, 26 years old and brilliant, working as a financial analyst for an American investment firm. She thought her father was a simple businessman who'd emigrated from Colombia decades ago to seek better opportunities. She had no idea that her college education had been paid for with blood money, that the family vacations to Europe had been funded by the systematic elimination of cartel rivals. She loved him unconditionally, the way daughters love fathers who read them bedtime stories and teach them to drive and walk them down church aisles. "You have a daughter," Diego said as if reading his thoughts. "Beautiful girl. I've seen the photos in your office upstairs." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Carlos felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same icy calm that had made him so effective in his previous life. "Leave her out of this. That's not how this works, hermano. You don't get to compartmentalize anymore. You don't get to play loving father on weekends and pretend the rest of it never happened." Around them, the party guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Carlos could see confusion on their faces, the dawning realization that their genial host was somehow connected to Argentina's most famous athlete in ways that made both men look murderous. The air conditioning hummed overhead, circulating the mingled scents of expensive cologne and Cuban cigars, but Carlos caught something else underneath, the metallic smell of fear. It was a scent he remembered well from his former life, the particular odor that clung to rooms where violence had been discussed in clinical detail. "What do you want?" Carlos asked finally. Diego smiled again, and this time there was satisfaction in it. "What I want is simple. I want you to remember what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you, the same way you made other people remember." The photograph disappeared back into Diego's jacket, but Carlos could still see it burned into his retinas. He remembered the moment it had been taken, remembered the camera flash cutting through the smoke from his cigarette. He'd thought all copies had been destroyed when he'd entered witness protection. The U.S. Marshals had been very specific about that. Complete erasure of his former identity, all evidence buried so deep it would never surface. But Diego Maradona wasn't bound by the limitations of federal agencies. Diego had connections that transcended borders and bureaucracies, relationships built on shared history and mutual benefit. If anyone could have preserved evidence from that night in Medellin, it would be him. 13 years, Diego continued, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. 13 years I've known exactly where you were, exactly what you were building, watching you play the respectable businessman, watching you raise your daughter, waiting for the right moment to remind you that some debts never get paid off. The words settled over Carlos like a shroud, carrying with them the weight of inevitability. This wasn't a chance encounter or a moment of recognition. This was an execution that had been planned for over a decade, as methodical and patient as any hit Carlos had ever orchestrated himself. Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but Diego wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket again, not for the photograph this time, but for something else. A manila envelope, worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times over the years. "Before you say anything else," Diego said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "I want you to understand exactly how long I've been preparing for this moment." He opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, savoring Carlos's growing dread. The first item he pulled out made Carlos's legs nearly buckle, a copy of his daughter's birth certificate. Not the amended version from his new identity, but the original, the one that listed her father as Carlos Eduardo Vega, born in Medellin, Colombia. "Sophie Isabella Mendoza," Diego read aloud. "Except that's not really her name, is it? Her real name is Sophie Isabella Vega, born October 15, 1997, at Hospital Italiano in Buenos Aires. Father listed as Carlos Eduardo Vega, wanted by Interpol for questioning in 17 unsolved murders." The room had gone so quiet that Carlos could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Politicians who had shared drinks with him for over a decade were staring at him like he was a stranger. Commissioner Rodriguez, whose gambling debts Carlos had quietly helped resolve last year, had gone pale as old bone. But Diego wasn't done. He pulled out another document, a bank statement from 1998 showing a deposit of $2.3 million into an account bearing Carlos's real name. Money that had been carefully laundered through a series of shell companies before finding its way into the legitimate businesses that had funded his respectable new life. "The beauty of digital records," Diego continued conversationally, "is that they never really disappear. They just hide in dark corners until someone with the right connections knows where to look." Carlos watched his carefully constructed world imploding in real time. Every relationship he'd built, every favor he'd called in, every bridge he'd constructed between his past and present, all of it dissolving as the men around him began to truly understand who they'd been drinking with for over a decade. Then Diego pulled out the final item, and Carlos felt his blood turn to ice. It was a letter. Not an official document or a photograph this time, but handwritten pages covered in familiar script. Carlos recognized the handwriting immediately because he'd helped forge documents in that same careful penmanship many times during his years with the cartel. "This arrived at my office 3 days ago," Diego said, unfolding the pages with theatrical precision. "Hand-delivered by a courier who disappeared before my security could ask him any questions. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to do the honors yourself?" Carlos's throat had gone completely dry. He knew what that letter contained, knew why Diego's eyes were shining with vindictive satisfaction. The worst part wasn't that his past had finally caught up with him. It was that it had been waiting for him all along, patient as a spider in its web. "I can see from your expression that you know exactly what this is," Diego said. "Your former associate in Medellin, the one who survived that night when you thought everyone had been eliminated. He's been very busy over the years, documenting everything: names, dates, locations, bank account numbers, safe house addresses, the complete operational structure of the Western Corridor smuggling route." The letter trembled in Diego's hands, and Carlos realized with growing horror that this wasn't the original. The pages were too clean, too crisp. This was a copy, which meant the real letter was somewhere else, somewhere safe. Somewhere it could be used as leverage indefinitely. "He wants to make a deal," Diego continued. "His freedom in exchange for testimony about the night you eliminated his entire crew to cover your tracks before defecting to the Americans. Apparently, he's been waiting 37 years to tell someone how Carlos El Martillo Vega murdered 6 of his own men to guarantee his passage into witness protection." The words hit Carlos like physical blows because they were absolutely true. That night in Medellin hadn't been about eliminating cartel rivals or sending messages to competing organizations. It had been about tying up loose ends before his carefully negotiated defection to U.S. federal protection. 6 men who could have identified him, 6 men who knew too much about his deal with American authorities, 6 men who had trusted him completely. "The beautiful irony," Diego said, his voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room, "is that your former partner has been in the same prison system you helped populate, sharing cells with men whose fathers and brothers you eliminated, learning exactly how much a man like you is worth on the inside." Carlos felt the last foundations of his false identity crumbling beneath him. This wasn't just exposure, it was a death sentence that had been 37 years in the making. The letter folded with a sound like breaking bones as Diego tucked it back into his jacket. Carlos stood frozen, his mind racing through options that dwindled with each passing second. Run, fight, deny everything, call his federal contacts. Each possibility crumbled before it fully formed, crushed by the weight of 37 years of accumulated evidence. "You're lying," Carlos said, but the words came out hollow, unconvincing even to himself. Around him, the party guests had begun to shift uncomfortably, some edging toward exits while others pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of unfolding disaster. Diego's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Am I? Tell me, Carlos, when was the last time you heard from your handler at the U.S. Marshals? Agent Morrison, wasn't it? The one who promised you'd never have to look over your shoulder again?" The name hit Carlos like ice water. Morrison had been dead for 15 years, killed in a car accident in Virginia that had made 3 lines in the Washington Post. Nobody should have known about Morrison except the handful of federal agents who'd been involved in Carlos's extraction from Colombia. Morrison's replacement might be interested to learn that their star witness has been running a nightclub frequented by half the corrupt officials in Buenos Aires, Diego continued, especially when those officials start asking uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy of their business relationships. Commissioner Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously, his face still drained of color. "Diego, perhaps this conversation would be better conducted privately?" "No." The word cut through the air like a blade. Diego's eyes never left Carlos's face, but his voice carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Privacy is what allowed this cancer to metastasize for 37 years. Privacy is what let a mass murderer become a pillar of society." Carlos felt the familiar weight of concealed weapons under his jacket, a habit he'd never been able to break despite decades of legitimate business. But the calculations that had kept him alive in Medellin seemed useless here. This wasn't a room full of cartel rivals or federal agents. These were judges, politicians, businessmen whose only weapons were influence and money. Men who would scatter at the first sign of real violence, which was exactly why Diego had chosen this venue. Not to kill Carlos, that would have been simple enough to arrange, but to destroy him slowly, methodically, in front of the very people whose respect had become the foundation of his new identity. "What do you want?" Carlos repeated, But this time the question carried different weight. Not the desperate plea of a cornered animal, but the professional inquiry of one predator acknowledging another's superior position. Diego smiled, and for a moment Carlos glimpsed something familiar in his expression. The cold satisfaction of a man who'd spent years planning the perfect move. I want you to understand that your daughter's graduation from university next month will be very well attended. My people have become quite fond of academic ceremonies. So educational. The threat landed with surgical precision. Carlos felt his carefully maintained composure crack, revealing the killer underneath. Several guests stepped back instinctively, recognizing predatory stillness even if they didn't understand its source. She doesn't know, Carlos said quietly. Of course she doesn't. That's what makes this so exquisite. Diego's voice carried the warm satisfaction of a chess master announcing checkmate. Sophie thinks her father built his fortune through legitimate real estate investments. She has no idea that her trust fund was seeded with money earned by breaking men's bones until they begged to die. The air conditioning cycled off, leaving the room in sudden oppressive silence. Carlos could hear his own breathing, shallow and controlled, the way it used to sound in the moments before violence became inevitable. But violence wasn't an option here, not anymore. Not when every move had been anticipated, every escape route blocked by years of careful preparation. Judge Martinez, who'd been Carlos's guest at countless dinners, finally found his voice. Perhaps we should all stay exactly where you are. Diego's tone remained conversational, but something in it made grown men freeze mid-step. Because this story has an ending, and everyone in this room is going to hear it. Especially the part about how Carlos Eduardo Vega's testimony sent 200 men to prison while he disappeared into witness protection with a new name and a fortune built on their graves. Carlos closed his eyes briefly, seeing Sophie's face the way she'd looked last Sunday at lunch, proud, happy, planning her post-graduation trip to Europe with money she believed came from her father's honest work. When she learned the truth, that expression would die forever, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a daughter discovering her father was a monster. 37 years, Diego said again, savoring the words. And now, finally, everyone gets to meet the real Carlos Vega. The room held its collective breath, waiting for Carlos's response, but he remained silent. There was nothing left to say. The trap had been perfect, patient, inescapable, and it was only beginning. The silence stretched like a held breath until Carlos finally opened his eyes, meeting Diego's gaze with the hollow acceptance of a man watching his own execution. Around them, the party had transformed into something else entirely, a tribunal where 30 years of lies were being systematically dismantled. You want to know what your father really did for a living? Diego asked, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, though his eyes remained fixed on Carlos. He specialized in disappearances, not the quick, merciful kind, the slow kind, the kind where families spent years wondering if their sons were still alive in some basement, praying for death. Commissioner Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving unconsciously toward the exit. Carlos watched the movement with detached interest, noting how quickly loyalty evaporated when self-preservation entered the equation. These men had been happy to accept his hospitality for years, to benefit from his connections and influence. Now they were calculating how fast they could distance themselves from the contamination of his true identity. The Ramirez family, Diego continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. 3 brothers who ran a competing smuggling route through the Eastern Corridor. Do you remember them, Carlos? Of course you do. You spent 6 days with the youngest one, Miguel. He was 17. Carlos felt something vital breaking inside his chest, a structural collapse that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the accumulated weight of buried memories. Miguel Ramirez. The boy had begged for his mother in those final hours, tears streaming down his swollen face as Carlos worked with methodical precision. Professional detachment had been essential then. Emotion was a luxury that got cartel enforcers killed. But standing here now, thinking of Sophie's face, Carlos finally understood what those tears had cost. Not just the boy's life, but something essential in the man who'd caused them. Something that 30 years of playing father and businessman had never been able to restore. The beauty of your particular skill set, Diego said, was that you never just eliminated problems. You extracted value first: information, bank codes, safe house locations. You turned torture into an art form, didn't you? A revenue stream. Judge Martinez had gone pale, his trembling hands reaching for a glass of whiskey that he couldn't quite seem to bring to his lips. Carlos recognized the expression, the moment when comfortable assumptions about the world's fundamental decency collapsed under the weight of raw truth. "I followed orders," Carlos said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Whose orders?" Diego's voice sharpened with predatory interest. "Because according to the letter I received, you went freelance toward the end. Started taking contracts from American intelligence agencies while you were still officially working for the cartel, playing all sides until you could engineer your own extraction." The room seemed to contract around Carlos as the final pieces of his exposure fell into place. This wasn't just about his past as an enforcer, it was about the specific betrayals that had purchased his new life, the systematic elimination of anyone who could have exposed his deal with federal authorities, the careful choreography that had let him walk away clean while better men died in Colombian prisons. "Sophie's going to ask questions," Diego continued, his voice taking on an almost sympathetic tone. "When she sees the news coverage, when the federal investigations start, when her friends begin avoiding her calls, she's going to want to understand how a man capable of love could also be capable of what you did to those families." Carlos thought of his daughter's laugh, the way she threw her head back when something genuinely delighted her. The sound would be different now, forever changed by the knowledge that it had been funded by screams. Every childhood memory would be retroactively contaminated, transformed from expressions of paternal love into evidence of monstrous hypocrisy. "What will you tell her?" Diego asked. "That you were young? That you needed the money? That the men you killed were criminals too, so somehow that balanced the scales?" The questions landed like physical blows because Carlos had asked them himself during the sleepless nights when his daughter was young. When she'd crawl into his bed after nightmares, seeking comfort from the same hands that had caused so many others to beg for death. He'd tried to convince himself that love could somehow retroactively justify horror, that being a good father could balance the cosmic ledger. But watching Diego's pitiless expression, Carlos realized how naive that hope had been. There was no absolution in fatherly devotion, no redemption in providing college tuition with blood money. Love built on lies wasn't love at all. It was just another form of violence, slower but no less devastating. 37 years, Diego said again, and Carlos understood now that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about time itself, about the interest that accumulated on moral debts, compounding relentlessly until they became impossible to repay. The trap had been perfect because it wasn't really a trap at all. It was simply the past finally catching up to the present, demanding its due with interest calculated in tears. Carlos stared at Diego's face, searching for some crack in the facade of righteous vengeance, some hint of the calculation that had to be driving this elaborate performance. And then he found it, a microscopic twitch at the corner of Diego's left eye. The same nervous tell he'd noticed in Medellin when Diego was bluffing at cards. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, not because it was shocking, but because it made perfect sense of everything that had never quite added up. Diego's impossibly detailed knowledge of classified operations, his access to federal documents that should have been buried in intelligence archives, the surgical precision with which he'd orchestrated tonight's destruction. "You knew," Carlos said quietly, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "You knew all along. In Colombia. You were working with them too." Diego's expression didn't change, but that tiny muscle beneath his eye jumped again. Carlos felt a bitter laugh building in his chest as 37 years of carefully constructed mythology collapsed around him. "My God," Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "You weren't waiting for revenge. You were waiting to see if I'd figure it out. How long have you been feeding information to federal agencies? Since before Medellin?" The party guests looked back and forth between them like spectators at a tennis match, sensing the shift in dynamics without understanding its source. Commissioner Rodriguez had stopped his slow retreat toward the exit, drawn back by the sudden change in Carlos's demeanor. "You're delusional," Diego said, but there was something different in his voice now, a fractional increase in volume that Carlos recognized as overcompensation. "The stress of exposure is—" "Miguel Ramirez," Carlos interrupted, and watched Diego's face go carefully blank. 17 years old. "You said I spent 6 days with him. But that's wrong, Diego. I spent 4 days with him. You know how I remember? Because you were there for the last 2. The silence that followed was different from before, not the shocked quiet of revelation, but the electric tension of 2 predators circling each other. Carlos could feel his mind working with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through decades of violence, analyzing details he'd been too traumatized to process at the time. "You were feeding them information about cartel operations," Carlos said, his voice taking on the flat, professional tone he'd once used to extract confessions. "American intelligence. That's how they knew exactly which smuggling routes to target, which safe houses to raid. That's how they knew I was ready to turn." Diego's composure cracked just enough to reveal something ugly underneath. "You're fishing, trying to drag me down with you." "The Ramirez brothers weren't competition," Carlos continued, the truth unfolding in his mind like a blueprint he'd been studying for 37 years without realizing it. They were going to expose the federal operation. They'd figured out that someone was feeding information to American authorities. That's why they had to disappear slowly, carefully. That's why you needed me to extract everything they knew before they died. Judge Martinez set down his whiskey glass with shaking hands, the crystal making a sharp sound against the marble table. Carlos noticed the movement peripherally, but his attention remained focused on Diego's face, watching decades of careful masks beginning to slip. "You orchestrated everything," Carlos said, feeling a perverse satisfaction in finally understanding the game he'd been playing without knowing it. "My extraction, my new identity. You made sure I got out clean because I was the only one who could tie you to those murders. We weren't just colleagues, Diego, we were partners." The word hung in the air like an accusation and a revelation simultaneously. Carlos thought of all the nights he'd lain awake, haunted by the faces of the men he'd killed, carrying the weight of their deaths alone. But he hadn't been alone. Diego had been there, in the shadows, pulling strings and managing assets while Carlos believed himself to be nothing more than a brutal tool in someone else's hand. 37 years, Carlos said, echoing Diego's earlier words with bitter understanding. "You've been protecting yourself all this time, not hunting me. Making sure I stayed quiet, stayed grateful for my new life. What changed? What made you decide it was finally time to burn it all down?" Diego's laugh was sharp, brittle. "You think you figured it all out? You think you're so clever?" "I think I'm a monster who just realized he wasn't the only monster in the room," Carlos replied. "The question is, which one of us has more to lose?" For the first time since the evening began, Carlos saw genuine uncertainty flicker across Diego's features. The perfect trap suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely, a desperate gambit by a man who'd been cornered by forces beyond his control. The hunter and the hunted had just switched places, and neither of them was prepared for what came next. The uncertainty in Diego's eyes lasted only a heartbeat before his expression hardened into something Carlos recognized from their bloodiest days in Colombia, the look of a man preparing to eliminate a liability. But now Carlos understood what he was seeing, not the cold calculation of a master manipulator, but the desperate improvisation of someone whose carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to collapse. "You want to know what changed?" Diego's voice carried a tremor that might have been rage or fear. 3 months ago, Miguel Ramirez's sister walked into a federal office in Miami with a box of letters her brother wrote, but never sent. Letters describing a man with a distinctive scar on his hand who spoke perfect English with an American accent. A man who knew details about U.S. military operations that no cartel enforcer should have possessed. Carlos felt his blood turn to ice water. His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, where he still carried the silver lighter that had given him that scar, a gift from a CIA handler whose name he'd never learned. Diego noticed the gesture and smiled with genuine malice. "She's been investigating her family's murder for 20 years, Diego continued. following paper trails, interviewing survivors, building a case that federal prosecutors are starting to take very seriously. And every thread she pulls leads back to the same uncomfortable truth. Someone inside American intelligence was coordinating with cartel enforcers to eliminate specific targets. The party guests had become a frozen tableau, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple confrontation between old enemies. Commissioner Rodriguez had his phone in his hand, though whether to call for help or simply document what might be the last moments of two men's lives remained unclear. "So you decided to eliminate the witnesses," Carlos said, understanding flooding through him with bitter clarity. "Starting with me. Make it look like the past finally caught up with a reformed criminal, rather than a federal asset being terminated to protect ongoing operations." "You always were perceptive when your life was on the line," Diego replied, "though you're missing the beautiful irony. Your daughter's graduation ceremony isn't just a threat, it's an opportunity, a chance for a grieving father to suffer a tragic accident while celebrating his child's achievement, the kind of poetic justice that closes investigations rather than opening them." Carlos thought of Sophie's voice on the phone last week, bubbling with excitement about her thesis defense, about the future she'd planned with money earned through systematic torture. The conversation took on a different meaning now, possibly the last normal exchange they'd ever have before everything she believed about her father's love was revealed as an elaborate performance by a professional killer. "But here's what you don't understand," Carlos said, his voice dropping to the register he'd once used in soundproofed basements. "I've been preparing for this conversation for 37 years. Not because I knew you were coming, but because I knew someone eventually would." He reached slowly into his jacket, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from Judge Martinez, and withdrew a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. Diego's eyes tracked the movement with predatory focus, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of a man who'd survived decades in environments where hesitation meant death. "Insurance," Carlos explained, setting the envelope on the marble table between them. "Every operation, every handler, every target we eliminated together. Names, dates, bank account numbers. The complete record of our partnership, including photographs of you meeting with federal agents in Bogotá. Amazing what a good telephoto lens could capture, even in 1986. The blood drained from Diego's face as he stared at the envelope. Carlos felt a savage satisfaction watching the predator realize he'd been stalking a trap of his own making. The years of careful positioning, of patient maneuvering, suddenly revealed themselves as an elaborate dance where both partners had been leading without the other knowing. "Mutual assured destruction," Carlos continued. "You expose me, and this documentation finds its way to every major news organization in 3 countries. We both burn, Diego. The only difference is that I made peace with that possibility decades ago." The room had become a powder keg where the slightest spark could trigger an explosion that would consume everyone present. Carlos could see the calculations running behind Diego's eyes, the same cold mathematics that had once determined how long to keep targets alive for maximum information extraction. "You're bluffing," Diego said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Carlos smiled, and several guests stepped backward instinctively. "There's only one way to find out. The question is, are you willing to bet your life on reading me correctly?" For 37 years, both men had been circling this moment, preparing for a confrontation that would determine which version of their shared history would survive. Now, finally face to face, they realized that neither of them was prepared for the cost of winning. The next move would determine everything, and both men knew it. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with 37 years of accumulated tension. Carlos watched Diego's face cycle through calculations, each micro-expression revealing the internal war between self-preservation and the desperate need to maintain control. Around them, the party guests had become unwilling witnesses to a confession that could topple governments. Then Diego laughed, a sound devoid of humor that seemed to scrape against the marble walls. "You magnificent bastard! You actually think you can walk away from this?" "I don't want to walk away," Carlos said, and the admission surprised him with its honesty. "I'm tired, Diego. Tired of carrying this alone. Tired of lying to Sophie, tired of pretending that love built on blood money means anything at all. He gestured toward the envelope between them. That documentation, it's not just insurance, it's a confession. Every name, every operation, every dollar we earned from those screams. The only question is whether it goes public as evidence in a murder investigation or as part of a voluntary disclosure to federal prosecutors. Diego's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing? The truth. Carlos felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. All of it. We walk into FBI headquarters together and tell them everything. Let them decide whether our cooperation is worth more than our prosecution. You're insane. Diego's voice rose sharply. Do you understand what happens to federal assets who expose their handlers? There are black sites where they do exactly what we used to do in those Colombian basements, Carlos interrupted. I know. The difference is that I made peace with that possibility the moment I decided to become Sophie's father, instead of just her provider. Judge Martinez had retreated to the far wall, his judicial composure shattered by the realization that his comfortable assumptions about justice were colliding with the messy reality of how intelligence operations actually functioned. Commissioner Rodriguez stood frozen, his phone still in his hand, understanding that whatever call he made would irrevocably alter the trajectory of multiple lives. She'll hate you, Diego said, playing his final card with surgical precision. When Sophie learns what you really are, what her college tuition actually cost, she'll never forgive you. That relationship you're so desperate to protect, it's already dead. You just haven't buried it yet. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Carlos could see his daughter's face changing as she absorbed the truth, the way her eyes would harden, the way she'd step backward as if physical distance could somehow separate her from the contamination of his love. Every birthday party, every bedtime story, every proud moment at her achievements would be retroactively poisoned by the knowledge of where the money had come from. But in that moment of imagined devastation, Carlos found something unexpected: clarity. You're right, he said quietly. She probably will hate me, but at least she'll be hating the real me, not the lie I've been performing for 30 years. That has to count for something. Diego's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate fear underneath. You're going to destroy everything, decades of operations, active assets. People will die because of your guilty conscience. People died because of our greed, Carlos replied. The only difference is that now we're going to take responsibility for it. He reached for the envelope, his fingers steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to unleash. Around him, he could feel the weight of history shifting, the careful architecture of lies and half-truths that had protected powerful men for decades beginning to crumble. Last chance, Diego. We do this together or I do it alone. But either way, the truth comes out tonight. Diego's hand moved toward his jacket, a reflexive gesture born of decades spent solving problems with violence. But Carlos was already moving, his body remembering skills that decades of peaceful nightclub management had never fully erased. Not to attack, but to protect the envelope, to ensure that even if Diego chose the path of blood, the documentation would survive. Stop. The voice came from behind them, sharp with authority that cut through the tension like a blade. Carlos turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, still wearing her travel clothes, her face pale with exhaustion and something else, a terrible understanding that suggested she'd heard more than anyone realized. "Hello, Papa?" she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the expensive crystal in the room seem fragile by comparison. "I think it's time we had that talk about your business partners." The game had changed completely, and Carlos realized that the truth he'd been so afraid to confront was already walking toward him with his daughter's eyes. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, its deep bronze notes echoing through the suddenly cavernous room. Carlos felt time fracture around that sound. Everything he'd built, everything he'd hidden, everything he'd loved crystallizing into this single moment where his daughter stood looking at him with eyes that held 30 years of trust and 30 seconds of terrible understanding. "How long have you been listening?" he asked, though he already knew from her expression that it had been long enough. Sophie stepped fully into the room, her travel bag sliding from her shoulder to land with a soft thud on the Persian rug. "Since you mentioned Miguel Ramirez's sister, Her voice was steady, clinical, the tone she used when presenting research findings. "I came here to surprise you for your birthday. I heard voices from the terrace and thought I'd wait until your guests left." She looked around the room, taking in the frozen tableau of wealthy men caught between their champagne glasses and their secrets, before her gaze settled back on him. "But these aren't really your guests, are they, Papa? They're your witnesses." Diego moved slightly, a predatory shift that Carlos caught in his peripheral vision. Without thinking, Carlos positioned himself between his daughter and the man who'd orchestrated 37 years of carefully managed truth. The movement was automatic, protective, and utterly damning. "Sophie, you need to leave," Carlos said quietly. "Now, whatever you think you heard, I heard you confess to torture and murder." Her words fell like stones into still water. "I heard you and Mr. Maradona discuss intelligence operations and federal handlers and something about blood money paying for my education." The envelope sat between them on the marble table like a confession waiting to be signed. Carlos could see Sophie's eyes tracking to it, her brilliant mind already cataloging evidence, building the case that would destroy any possibility of the relationship they'd built together. 27 years old, she continued, her voice growing softer and somehow more terrible. "My entire adult life, I've wondered why other fathers seemed so ordinary compared to mine, why you understood loss in a way that felt biblical, why you sometimes looked at me like you were afraid I might disappear, Sophie, why you never talked about my mother's death, why there were no photographs from before I was 3, why you chose to build a nightclub empire in a city where you had no family, no history, no connections." She was crying now, but her voice remained steady. Carlos realized that she wasn't just his daughter in this moment. She was a prosecutor building an indictment, using skills he'd paid for with money earned through systematic brutality. All those bedtime stories about starting over, about second chances, about how love could redeem any mistake. She laughed, and the sound broke something in Carlos's chest. They weren't stories, were they? They were confessions. Judge Martinez made a small sound of distress from his position against the wall. Commissioner Rodriguez had lowered his phone, apparently understanding that whatever authority he represented was meaningless in the face of this intimate devastation. "I need you to understand something," Carlos said, his voice rough with 3 decades of accumulated grief. "Every moment of love I gave you was real. Every sacrifice, every proud smile, every night I stayed awake worried about your future. That was your father speaking, not the man I used to be." "How can you know the difference?" Sophie asked. And the question contained multitudes. How can either of us know where the killer ends and my father begins? Carlos looked at the envelope, then at Diego, then back at his daughter's face. The face that had been his North Star, his redemption, his proof that monsters could learn to love something more than their own survival. "Because," he said slowly, "your father is the man who's about to walk into FBI headquarters and tell them everything. The man who's choosing your future over his own freedom. The man who loves you enough to let you hate him." He picked up the envelope and held it out to her. "It's all here. Every name, every operation, every dollar that paid for your life. I won't ask you to forgive me, but I need you to believe that deciding to be your father was the only purely good choice I ever made." Sophie stared at the envelope for a long moment, then looked back at his face. "What happens now?" "Now I stop running from who I was and start living with who I choose to be." Carlos felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but the exhaustion that comes after carrying an impossible weight for too long. "And you decide whether 30 years of real love can survive the truth about where it came from." The room held its breath as Sophie reached for the envelope. Outside, Buenos Aires continued its restless dance between sin and redemption, unaware that in one marble-appointed chamber, a father and daughter were discovering the true cost of love built on buried secrets. Whatever came next, the lies were finally over.